Welcome to the debate. Today we are examining one of the most intellectually demanding works in contemporary theory, Lamellipodia, toward a psychogametological theory of biolinguistic survival. And this text, it really forces us to ask a fundamental question about identity, about persistence in the 21st century. How does any system of meaning, or what the author calls biolinguistic survival, persist in the face of immense pressure?
Right, and that pressure being specifically the biopolitical forces and semiotic corrosion that attempt to capture and dissolve human subjectivity, reducing it down to an economically useful data point. That capture mechanism is the real antagonist here.
Precisely. And this leads to our central question today. Is biolinguistic survival, the persistence of meaning and self-achieved, primarily through the active refusal of this cultural and semiotic capture? Or is it achieved through participation in the very grammar of contamination and collapse? Now, I argue for separation, anchored in metabolic resistance against capture. Survival is an act of saying no.
And I take the opposing view. Because while resistance seems intuitive, I believe the text compels us toward assimilation and, generative participation in the corrosive process itself. Survival in this framework is less about boundary defense and much more about leveraging the inevitable breakdown. The focus shifts from purity to utility.
So my position, and I'm drawing this straight from the material, is that survival is fundamentally a metabolic declaration of separation. The material is remarkably explicit on this. The definition of liberation is the refusal of capture. And to understand this, we have to look at what's trying to capture us. The text introduces the concept of the cultural vesicle, a powerful metaphor for media or economic or governmental systems that try to package and digest subjectivity into economic coherence. When we face that, the declaration, "I am not a prisoner," has to function less as a political slogan and more as a necessary metabolic statement, an internal, structural act of resistance that precedes language. If the self is immediately overwritten, there's nothing left to debate.
I understand the instinct to establish that boundary, but I think that view relies on an idealized version of the self that the text actively dismantles. If we accept that the contamination is already systemic, then resistance becomes a thermodynamic impossibility.
But the material anchors this resistance, surprisingly, in specific biological structures. Integrins. Integrins are usually proteins that mediate cell adhesion, how a cell sticks to its external environment. The author refigures them, arguing they must operate not as passive mediators of attachment, but as self-stabilizing thresholds of survival and heteropoietic operators. They encode persistence, resistance, and a minimal ethics of contact.
That phrase, minimal ethics of contact, is a critical hinge. But I interpret it as defining the moment of engagement, not rejection. I think framing integrins as a defensive wall fundamentally misreads the mechanism of survival the text proposes. If the threat is biopolitical pressure and systemic semiotic corrosion, survival is not immunity. It's defined as participation in its grammar. We have to focus on the generative nature of breakdown, the way the system is designed to fail creatively. The material describes structural and semiotic collapse not as simple destruction, but as being characterized by hyperplasia. And this is a highly technical term meaning an overproduction of cells, or in this context, an overproduction of meaning. This is induced by interference pressure, where meaning multiplies beyond any functional necessity. This generative collapse, this shift, is presented as the central mode of transition.
That seems incredibly risky. How can you argue for generative collapse if the goal is survival?
Because the model for thought and persistence is no longer the bounded human agent. It's Physarum polycephalum, the acellular slime mold. This organism propagates fluidity and decentralization, and critically, for the text, it's a system where decoherence is desired upregulation. In plain terms, scattering, confusion, and complexity are actively sought, not avoided. The resulting messy system is just more robust. In this corrosive framework, excretion, or what we might call semantic waste, becomes productive. Life is created through expulsion, what the text provocatively calls a kind of cosmic cannibalism. Post-human survival is defined as freedom from parasitic organs of psychic replication, the internalized cultural mechanisms that force us to constantly reproduce the traditional self, not mere resistance to the contamination itself.
I see why you emphasize that shift away from the traditional self. But your model immediately raises the question of subjectivity, right? The efficacy of metabolic refusal versus semiotic inscription. If you participate in the grammar of contamination, how can one possibly avoid being instantly digested by what the text calls the narrative toxoplasm?
That is the core fear, the immediate loss of agency.
Exactly. The narrative toxoplasm is described as a parasitic narrative think of a viral meme or an ideology that hijacks the host's behavior entirely. The initial metabolic resistance, that minimal ethics of contact encoded in the integrins, must define that boundary. Without that metabolic statement of "I am not a prisoner," subjectivity is instantly overwritten by structural pornography, which is defined as abrasion that spreads like an arthropod infestation. Your model seems to guarantee the erasure of the core self in the attempt to utilize corrosive pressure.
I see why you think that, but I come at it from a different way. I think we misunderstand both the nature of that inscription and the speed of capture. I agree the threat is real, but the text describes structural pornography specifically as a bacterial inscription, not a sudden viral takeover. Bacteria implies a slow corrosion, a wear that transforms meaning into pressure rather than instantly annihilating it. This difference in speed is crucial. If it's slow wear, we have time to react, to adapt.
But the result is still the overriding of the original material. You are defining the system as one where ultimately the host loses.
Not necessarily. The text argues for a paradoxical purity, pursued through contamination. The host exceeds to purity only by being overwritten, by incorporating the corrosive forces and using the resulting friction. If resistance to the inscription, once it has begun, is futile because the pressure is systemic, then the only robust option is to utilize the resulting kinetic energy generated by that slow systemic abrasion. The question moves from, how do I stop it, to how do I ride the wave?
That brings us to our second point, interpreting biolinguistic collapse and the resulting excess. You emphasize the need to leverage this excess, this hyperplasia, but it seems to ignore the need for negotiated form.
Well, I maintain that your emphasis on resistance to maintain that minimal ethical boundary is an attempt to constrain a process that must be unleashed. The theory frames biolinguistic collapse as a redundancy response characteristic of pornography, and here we must define the author's use of pornography, which is technical, not moral. It describes an environment where exchange replaces interpretation. Everything is immediately available, transactional, stripping away any depth or transcendental meaning. And the crucial point is this. Excess itself, while sacrificial in the sense of a battalion economic system, which demands constant non-productive expenditure, is biologically etched into the host. If the cultural vesicle is designed to make us overproduce, survival must leverage this inherent excessive production, this hyperplasia, rather than trying to constrain it, the unethics of contact that is fundamentally designed to limit rupture. The pressure is already systemic. Why fight the system with a local ethical barrier?
That's a compelling argument regarding the nature of the excess, but I would frame the required response differently. I agree that the etiology is battalion, demanding purity through expenditure. However, the act of liberation is not simply letting the excess flow. The liberation is the refusal of the economic coherence that the cultural sphere demands. It's an assertion of autonomy within the chaos. Yes, excess is produced, but the integrity of the surviving structure requires the negotiation of that rupture. You mentioned that structural pornography replaces interpretation with exchange. So what prevents the self from being completely flattened and becoming merely an exchange mechanism?
My argument is that the complexity arising from the decoherence prevents flattening. The multiplication of meaning itself, the hypertrophy, serves as the necessary complexity.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the minimal ethics of contact provided by integrins is precisely the mechanism needed to negotiate rupture and sustain form. It prevents the catastrophic flattening of causation caused by semantic Lamellipodia.
Now we introduce the Lamellipodia, the structure for which the entire text is named. Explain their role here, because I see them as entirely fluid structures that define my position.
Lamellipodia are broad, sheet-like protrusions of the cell membrane, usually involved in movement and adhesion. The semantic Lamellipodia described in the text are the mechanisms of semiotic flattening. They are deemed pornographic in the technical sense precisely because they strip away the transcendental reserve, the layered meaning, and allow for that immediate, frictionless exchange. The integrin, acting as the ethical threshold, structures the movement, preventing the movement itself from consuming the subject's capacity for autonomous meaning. It is not an attempt to eliminate excess, but to structure its flow away from pure economic exchange.
But structure implies an anthropocentric control, and I believe the text is explicitly moving us away from that kind of control, particularly when discussing cognition itself, which brings us to our final point of contention.
I think the opposite is true. That's precisely the point of this final contention. Cognition and transboundary thought. The movement away from simplistic neural quantum explanations of cognition towards transboundary thought, thought that extends beyond the skull and into the symbolic and genetic landscape, requires structured routes of amplification, not uncontrolled fluid collapse. And the author provides a vital example. Literary reading persists as a psychogametic practice. It's an internal symbolic process that doesn't just react to the world. It actively ramifies murder and excess into structured routes. This structured amplification, the production of what the text calls syntactic blood and event logic, is a focused process of symbolic breakdown that is simultaneously generative.
I see why you highlight that ramification, but I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the resulting structure is due to active resistive control. The focus on psychogametic practice implies a reproductive, almost genetic process of self-organization, which is entirely decentralized. Look again at the Fissurum polycephalum model. It demonstrates that thought propagates. It produces waves of effect that become transparent through predictable branching, similar to the growth of a root system. Observation and complexity increase not by clarity or a subject's assertion of control, but by multiplicity, that decoherence as desired upregulation. We don't understand the structure less because it's messy. We understand it more because it has multiplied its potential states.
That seems like an abdication of agency. How can we speak of survival if the structure is merely a predictable product of propagation?
Because the decentralized, non-decisional process modeled by Fissurum suggests that survival is less about the subject asserting rigid metabolic boundaries and more about the horizontal propagation of layered host persuasion. The structure emerges organically from the sheer pressure and the movement of the semantic Lamellipodia. It doesn't need the integrin to rigidly enforce an initial ethic. And this also changes how immunity functions. Immunity in this framework becomes phonetic, meaning it functions as a relational sound wave or signal, not a rigid defensive wall. A phonetic boundary is a relational event. It's understood by its interaction with others, not by its internal fortitude. It is a boundary that exists because it is heard, not because it is metabolically rigid.
That's an interesting perspective on relational immunity. But if the boundary is merely relational sound, what prevents it from being drowned out by the noise of the structural pornography? My core contention is that for biolinguistic survival to be meaningfully survival, a form of separation that nonetheless embodies continuity, it requires the active recognition and metabolic maintenance of these boundaries. The integrity of the self resides in the metabolic capacity for separation, asserting resistance through self-stabilizing structures like the refigured integrins, and rejecting narrative capture, even if that capture offers temporary energetic advantages through hyperplasia. It's about maintaining definition against an environment designed for systemic wear.
And I maintain that true post-human survival is fundamentally a process of assimilation and leveraging systemic pressures. It is achieved not by resisting contamination, but by participating fully in its grammar, utilizing the resulting hyperplasia and corrosive semiotic pressure to achieve a decentralized, anti-fragile persistence. We find freedom from the restrictive organs of psychic replication by giving up the fight for purity and asserting autonomy through multiplicity.
Indeed. What the source material teaches us is that understanding under these intense biopolitical conditions is psychogametological. It's a process of reproducive meaning-making that resembles a battalion ignition transcript of prayer. It forces us to examine our fundamental assumptions about selfhood.
And the value of this discussion is certainly in appreciating how semiotic forms colonize by expressing constructed strength rather than truth, and recognizing that both separation and participation are crucial evidence-based lenses through which to explore the profound complexities of this material. The convergence of genetic and symbolic breakdown outlined in Lamellipodia demands this rigorous exploration of conflicting survival mechanisms.